Welcome, everyone. My name is Tani Schwartzherman, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to our spring webinar series, Timely Insights, Timeless Wisdom, where we have the opportunity to hear from JTS's renowned faculty to learn about their current scholarly work and greatest passions. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's session, Awaiting the Good Hour, Hope in the Bible as a Resource for Religious Life, with Dr. Amy Kalmanofsky, Dean of Liss College and Kekst Graduate School, and Blanche and Romie Shapiro, Professor of Bible at JTS. If you're feeling inspired by this opportunity to learn with JTS's outstanding scholars, we invite you to partner with us by sponsoring a learning session. We offer 3 sponsorship levels: Chacham at $540, Sadiq at $1,000, and Navi at $1,800. We'll post a link in the chat as well so you can learn more about sponsoring a session. Just going to go over the format for today's session. Rabbi Andelman regrets that she's not able to be with us today, but we're pleased to have Ellie Gettinger, who will moderate the Q&A. And Dr. Kalmanofsky will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll also have some time for Q&A at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Ellie Gettinger. And during the Q&A period, Ellie will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Kalmanofsky. Since we receive a lot of questions, kindly express your question both clearly in complete sentences and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with me, Tani Schwartzherman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received earlier today. We'll be screen sharing them as well. And we'll also share a link in the chat. And we're so pleased to have Dr. Amy Kalmanofsky teaching us today. As I mentioned earlier, Dr. Kalmanofsky is the Blanche and Romie Shapiro Professor of Bible and Dean of Albert A. Liss College of Jewish Studies, JCS's undergraduate school, as well as the Dean of Gershon Kekst Graduate School. As Professor of Bible, she teaches courses on biblical literature, religion, and feminist interpretation of the Bible. Dr. Kalmanofsky is a deeply committed teacher and helps her students understand and appreciate the Bible's complicated beauty and meaning so that they can become careful and creative interpreters of its text. Dr. Kalmanofsky is the author of several books and has also written numerous articles examining the biblical representation of women and the roles women play in the Bible. And you can read more information about Dr. Kalmanofsky is available on the bio that we included with the sources. And I'm so pleased to turn it over to Dr. Kalmanofsky.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Happy Eclipse Day to everybody. I'm honored that instead of going to an eclipse party, you're spending some time learning Torah. So that feels really great. It's great to be here with all of you. And as Tani just said, I certainly happy to engage and pause for questions at any point, but I'm also going to, I like to teach and I like a kind of interactive teaching. So there will be moments where I will ask you questions, including at the very beginning, so that we can actually feel that we're learning together. So I'm going to actually start off with a question that I love asking this question because I really do welcome the various different responses I get, and I'm choosing my words very clearly. What I want to ask you all to take in and think about, and also write some responses in the chat before I give you my own answer to this question. But I want to begin with a question that is, what are the core qualities that define a religious person? And I'm going to ask that again, slowly and clearly, and that will give you hopefully some time just to sort of, you can give out one-word answers. But the question is, what are the core qualities that define a religious person? So I'm going to pause for just a few seconds while you think, and you can write some responses in the chat. And, I actually am using specifically words like, I'm seeing people already responding, which is great. Excellent. I use the word religious, and some people might find that a little bit of an, maybe prefer the word spiritual, but I see people are responding, which is great. So just looking at the chat, which I'm sure you all can see, kindness was the first and foremost. We have reverence for God, respect for all. Well, there's a lot. Spirituality, faith, believer. These are all really wonderful. Prayer. These are all really wonderful responses. But since I'm the one talking at you at this moment and you're just writing, keep them going. That's great. I'm going to give you my own answer to that question, which are just sort of in some ways, what I see as being the core qualities. And you can, they're not meant to be inclusive. They're just the core qualities that I identify. The first, I would say, for me, a religious person should have these qualities. And I see some of this. So that for me, I wouldn't say in any particular order, but a capacity for awe and reverence, a capacity for awe and reverence. And by that, I mean a recognition and appreciation for something greater than the individual that provides context for and meaning to life, right? So a religious person should have a capacity for awe and reverence. Let me just sort of tie it a little bit to the moment. I don't know if people read the New York Times yesterday. I think the article is still on there, but the secular need for awe was connected to actually all the excitement in frankly, all the attention paid right now to the eclipse watching was sort of said that human beings really need awe. But for me, recognizing awesome moments is only one part of it. The reverence part is also an appreciation for the awesome moments that give our lives meaning and greater context. So that's the first quality. The second quality, I would say, a core quality of a religious person, is a generosity of spirit. I think a religious person has to be a generous person, generous of spirit. And by that, I actually mean a willingness to see good in others, to support others, and to give to others. That to me is what it means to be generous, right? And it's not just giving things, but generous of spirit, right? Being able to see the good in others. Another core quality, I would say, is an ability to feel and express gratitude, which I actually see in the chat. Some of you also said, and I think that's really so. A person should be able to be, a religious person should be able to feel and express gratitude, and that I would say is an ability to recognize gifts that are both large and small, gifts that are expected and unexpected, and that a religious person should have the impulse to say thank you, right? To recognize the gifts and feel grateful to them. So those are the three sort of core qualities, but there's a fourth core quality that I've been thinking a lot about, and it's actually the topic for today's learning. And I would say that a religious person must feel and express hope. Right? I'm going to say that again. So for me, one core quality is that a religious person must feel the capacity to feel, but also to express hope. And I want to talk about hope today. I think this is actually one of the most essential things that we can be thinking about right now. I think we must be thinking about hope. So in true academic fashion, I always like to, as I said a moment ago, I'm very specific about the language I use. And, I'm always willing to be pushed. But the fact that I said, what are core religious as opposed to spiritual, I meant that, I was very intentional with that language. And so I sort of wanted to begin our conversation with thinking about definitions of hope. What do we mean when I say, we're going to talk about hope? What is hope? And then I want to also think specifically and together about a very specific kind of hope that I'm identifying, which I am labeling religious hope. So first I want to define what hope is, and then I want to think together about what religious hope is. Now, I think when we use, we use language very casually. Very often when we use the word hope in kind of casual conversations, it's another word for want. I hope for something, right? When you say that to somebody, very often what you're really saying is, I want something, right? And I'm actually trying to make a distinction between wanting and hoping. So I'm going to give you two definitions that I have found very useful in forming my own definition on what hope is. And these are definitions that come from social scientists. I found them actually. So just so you all know, this is really the start of a project that I'm working on. I'm working on a project that's going to be looking at hope in the context of the Bible. So I'm at the early stages of that. So actually having this kind of learning together is really helpful to me in sort of articulating my ideas and helping me have language to define. So I'm going to give you two definitions that I have found to be very useful in forming my own definition. And these are both from social scientist contexts. So the first is, this comes from an article that's called Feeling Hopeful in a journal called Political Psychology. It is that hope is a future-oriented emotion that is experienced in the present when an individual believes that current circumstances can and should change. Right? You don't, I mean, this is just, I'm getting some language out there, and I'm going to give you my own much simpler definition so people don't have to remember all the details of this. But the second definition that I also found useful was, this one comes from a social scientist named Richard Lazarus, who has written a book on hope that I found very helpful. And he writes, to hope is to believe that something positive, which does not presently apply to one's life, could still materialize, and so we yearn for it. So these are the two definitions that I found very helpful. Here's my definition, much simpler, much smaller. My definition is, hope is the desire for a better but possible future. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Hope is the desire for a better but possible future. Again, every word that I'm using, I've carefully chosen, and we're going to talk about it. But this language of possible, I think, is really important. So before I talk about the specifics of what I'm defining as being religious hope, a kind of hope, I want to talk about essential features of hope kind of writ large that you can even hear in my definition. So first and foremost, hope is future oriented, right? It expresses a desire for something not present, right? And for circumstances to change, right? You hope for something in the future. Now, I mean, we can get into their different, and I do think it's good to use language casually and all of that. But to me, there is also a difference between, I hope to eat an apple in the future, right? Which is a future oriented desire, versus I hope to, for world peace in the future, right? These are different, I think we can all see different levels. And in fact, I'm beginning to work with the language of sort of a simple desire, like I want to eat an apple, that doesn't really change the world. And what I'm calling a more encompassing desire for the future that really does ask for circumstances to change in order for that reality to come true. But hope is future oriented. It expresses a desire for something not present, for circumstances to change. So that's number one. Number two about hope is an active force, right? And this is really quite interesting. Hope can be disruptive, right? It can disturb and it can challenge accepted beliefs. But, and this is really important, hope as an active force can also lead to transformative behavior. Hope is a very powerful force to tap into, right? And as we move into thinking about hope in a religious context, you can kind of see why I think hope is so essential. But we know that hope has been, is essential in any number of contexts, including a political context. In fact, have been whole political campaigns, right, that are in some ways based on hope and change, right? That was actually those were the taglines for Obama. So hope is, in fact, it's a future-oriented emotion, and it's also an active force. Now, here's where things get a little bit more, to my mind, kind of more interesting. And these are sort of in kind of questions that I'm still asking myself. But I would say there is often, but not always, often, but not always, a relationship between hope and despair. One could say that they are sort of flip sides of a coin, but the question of the relationship between hope and despair is interesting, right? And do you know what, in some ways, is hope integral? Is it connected to despair? Right? Is there some kind of dissatisfaction that has to be in order for somebody to feel hope? That's a genuine question. And another question that I'm asking myself, which, as you can see from my own, the definition that I offered you, I kind of already have answered it, but I think it's, to be honest, still a question. When I say that hope is the desire for a better but possible future, right? I seem to have decided, but I am still asking, what is the relationship between hope and rationality? Must something be possible for one to hope for it? Right. And that I would like to say that at least it has to be possible. There might have to be radical transformation in order for the thing that you hope to come into being. But I would say, just to use actually, this is a great example, right? I was about to use the example of, can I hope for the sky being purple? That's not actually, something I think you shouldn't really hope for that. That's not possible. But could I say something like, just to be in the spirit of the day, I hope that there's like total darkness at 2:30 in the afternoon, right? I can hope for that. There is possibility, even though it seems sort of outside the norm. So this, to me, it's a real question to sort of figure out the relationship between hope and rationality, and must something be possible for one to hope for it, right? So that's sort of thinking about hope in general. And now I want us to focus on what I'm considering to be a specific kind of hope, which I label religious hope. And here is my definition of religious hope, which is then, I think, going to be the bedrock of what we're going to look at going forward. So for me, religious hope is the belief that we are guided toward a better and attainable future through our engagement with religious life, right? And I think the difference here really is the guided, right? I think that hope in general is the hope in a better and possible future. But to me, what it means to be a religious person, and I'm happy for you, I'm talking to you all very personally right now, and sort of my own, how I experience this. But to me, what it means to be a religious person is the belief that we are guided toward a better and attainable future through our engagement with religious life, right? That our religious lives will lead us towards that better future. Okay. I can pause here to see if there are any kind of definitional, if anyone has any questions or comments, I'm happy to do that.
I
If this
have a
seems like
couple that have come up.
okay.
And this is such a delightful framework, and I think such an important framework because, as you know, and when you talk about this relationship between hope and despair, we tend to get really stymied in the despair part. So I love this idea of amplifying and really focusing on the hope instead, with that idea of rationality and making things attainable, not these. So the first of the questions is, and to this extent of, what about hoping for miracles? We're about to celebrate Passover, which
Yes.
is totally embedded on the idea that, we were redeemed and taken out on dry land, and all of these things happen because of God's intervention. So how does this fit into your framework of religious hope?
So I think it does. I mean, to some extent, that is precisely in some ways what I'm kind of, the nuance I have in a better and possible future. I mean, it depends on, actually, I would say I would just throw the question back in terms of what you define as kind of miraculous,
Hmm.
right? You know, I mean, you can hope in miracles, but that's not, and I think that's fine. And that is in some ways, I think, exactly what you're saying, a kind of gesture of desperation, right? That's not really, because what I'm actually going to be talking today is I think we need to really cultivate a feeling of hope. It's actually something that we have to cultivate together. And so when you sort of say like hope and miracles, you're sort of saying like, well, it's not really in my hands. I need something completely like a total intervention, and there's nothing I can do. So I think, it fits into a kind of religious hope, but it's not necessarily the kind of hope that I'm trying to kind of discuss at this particular moment. Yeah.
More in the realm of like practical applications. This also came up as you gave your four, elements of what it means to be a religious person. You never mentioned God.
Well, so I did exactly. Yes.
So,
So I mean,
so
all of this 100%, which is why, so let me just say this. And again, yes. And I would say it's really quite interesting. That was partly my choice in using the word religious and not spiritual. And I am about to talk about God in a moment. But in some ways, my language of religious is that, for me anyway, is a term that includes God and but allows room for people who are not necessarily wanting to name some kind of supernatural entity that is God, but see God in a different way. But yes, I mean, to me, what I'm saying about the difference between religious hope and, I don't even like the term secular hope, but a different kind of hope, is this guiding force. Right. And to me, that guiding force is what defines religious hope. And I would call that God. Right. So that is, to me, why I use that. And yes, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting that I am hesitant to name that outright. Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of, and I think clearly this is going to be a session in which people have lots of questions and we will not
Yes.
be. So I want to just kind of go for one more and then I will
Okay.
jump back into your presentation. Is there this sense, I think there are a couple of questions in this same universe of whether hope and belief are interchangeable. And then also, does hope have to be connected to an action? Or is it something that can just be connected to I hope this doesn't stop. I hope this keeps going. I hope
Yeah.
that my team can keep winning. That's probably not the way, but we are at the end of March Madness now. So I feel like a lot
Yeah.
of people there.
Yeah. No, I mean, again, I'm, working with a definition that is, in some ways I'm, being more narrow with how I'm defining hope. So for me, I would say, no, I think that hope is a transformative, uh, leads to transformation. I mean, I suppose and so to me, something like, I hope this doesn't end, I get that. And that seems more to me what I would say is want and not hope. Like, I think hope is transformative. And again, hope is a future focused. I'm being very academic in this way because it's a particular kind of desire. But for me, the future focus is important and the transformational element is important. It's not simple desire. I do want to say, I mean, we're going to get into hope and belief because I do think there is, as I said, a connection between despair and hope. And I think it's really interesting to think about that. And I do think there is a connection between religious hope and belief and faith. Like, I think these are also integrated ideas. So I do think in my concept of what I'm saying, because I did say, right, with religious hope, belief that we are guided toward a better and attainable future through our engagement with religious life. So I did say that. So I think belief is part of that. I want to say one other definitional thing, because it's really quite interesting to me to think about this. I also want to differentiate between hope and expectation. Right? Because simply that you hope, I mean, because we're going to see a lot of hope expressed in the Bible, and it is a belief in a future, right? A better future. But no individual can expect that to happen at any given moment. Right? There's a certain sense you believe that it is attainable, you believe in a better future, but nobody can expect it to happen at any particular moment. Right? Which is so the relationship between hope and expectation is also quite interesting. So just to get back into the presentation, I want to say, because it's clear, I mean, I think that this is, as I said a few moments ago, I think we as a society, I think we as Jews, right? I think we as religious people, and I know that there's a lot of people and, that will maybe not define themselves as religious people, but I think we have to think about hope. I think that we have to develop the capacity and language for hope. I think it is essential to our well-being, and it's essential to moving us forward towards some kind of good, right? We have to believe in a better future, right? We have to, first of all, we have to believe there is a future, which, to me, that's like, secular hope, whatever we want to say. I think that's not a given for a lot of people. And, I'm talking to you, I work with young people a lot. And I ask them a lot, about whether they feel hopeful. And I mean, I think we all read the same kinds of, we know that young people are filled with despair right now. So I think it is essential that we think about hope, and more essential that we develop the capacity and language for hope so that we can think about a better future. I think that it is extremely hard in today's world, and not just because we go from crisis to crisis, right, to have hope. I think that's, that's true. I mean, I was talking to some of our graduating seniors. I mean, these are kids that really have grown up going from crisis to crisis. And I don't know what's going to happen next, nor do they. Right. And I think, for those reasons, they really do have, I don't say they are hopeless. I don't want to give that. But, I think that they need help developing a capacity to hope. But I also want to say that just all of us in general, we live in a kind of relentless present. Right. I mean, I think about this, and it really is the stimulation that I would say of our social media and just how we communicate with each other. But, everything, we can access everything so quickly in the moment, right? There's just so much present stimulation that it's just hard for everyone, right? Not just about the crisis, but the way that we are being conditioned to speak to one another, that it's hard for all of us to have this, to develop this capacity for hope and thinking about the future. But I think it is absolutely essential that we do. So I just wanted to say that if we're going to have a better future, I think we have to hope for that future so we can transform our world and actually, hopefully, help create that better future. The other thing I want to say before getting into the texts themselves, I actually think that religious people, and I consider myself to be one of those, but also people who study religion, which I certainly also am, are particularly poised to help cultivate hope. Right? I think it's, because I do think that embedded in our texts, like it's just so much part of the language and the air that we breathe, that we have a particular sensitivity and capacity and are able to help others cultivate hope. And speaking particularly as, certainly as a Jew, but as a Bible scholar, I look to the Bible, I look to the Torah as a resource for cultivating hope. Right. And, part of, I mean, that's my project in some ways that I'm going to be working on, is not just looking at how hope is expressed in the Bible, how the Bible attempts to cultivate hope, but actually, and this is really a genuine, kind of appeal to you all, is really thinking about whether the Bible, right, this ancient text, can be a resource for us in terms of cultivating our own language of hope. And, I want the answer to that to be yes. Because I feel like that's what it means to be Jews, is we inherit these sacred texts, and they should continue to be a resource for them. We shouldn't just study them. They should help us live better lives. So I want that answer to be yes, but I'm at the beginning of this project and we'll see what I'll end up, where I'll end up. But the questions that I want to just now, these are the general questions that we can be thinking about as we go into the material that I've selected. The general questions are: how and where is hope expressed or cultivated in the Bible? So just think about that a second. And you can write those questions in the, so how and where is hope expressed or cultivated in the Bible? second question, which is, I love this question. We'll hopefully come back at the end of it, because it may sound like an easy question to answer, but I don't think it is. Is the Bible overall a hopeful book? Right? And I want you all to think about the fact, yes, there are texts within the Bible that cultivate hope, that express hope. But this question of whether the Bible overall is a hopeful book, I think is a really interesting question to ask yourselves. And I look at it as, and this is sort of hope and despair, is the Bible oriented towards the land of Israel and living in the land of Israel? Or is the Bible oriented towards being in exile? That's actually a really significant question to think about. And always, just so I always like to, we're going to look at I like to bring a lot of texts together, but I always think about this, like if you think about how the Torah ends, it's like my favorite text in some ways to look at is actually the death of Moshe, which is like an incredibly poignant moment. But just think about that moment, because Moshe, dies looking at the land. He doesn't get to go into it, right? That's a very hopeful image. And yet he remains in exile and is actually buried in Moab, right? Sort of buried in exile. And to me, that encapsulates this, like the heart of this question. Is the Bible oriented towards hope, oriented towards Israel, or is the Bible oriented towards exile and the experience of exile? So that to me is like a really interesting question that we'll go hopefully come back to. So, and then the final question, which I just asked, and I certainly also, can the Bible be a resource for us to develop a capacity for hope? And as I said, for me, the answer should be yes, but it's not easy, right? We're inheriting a very ancient text that has a very specific language and uses this very specific, set of images to express itself. And as somebody who's a Bible scholar and teaches it, it ain't always so easy to translate those images and that language to a contemporary audience. So to think together about whether the Bible can be a resource for developing the capacity for hope, for me, I hope that is the case, but it's a genuine question. So just going back to the first question, and I would say here, to separate out, let's just think, when I think about Bible, I'm sort of talking about all the Bible, right? So including, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, all of it. But now I want to just sort of think, when you're thinking about just the Torah, right? The 5 books of Moses. So if you think about where in the Torah do we find hope expressed or hope cultivated, right? In those first 5 books of the Torah, the books of Moses, where do we find hope expressed or hope cultivated? Is a really interesting question. And just in the interest of time, so we have, I'll give you what I think is the answer, but there may be other answers. And so, Ellie, if you find others, I'm always looking, for other answers. But for me, I would say the place that I find it most directly expressed is actually in what I would label to be the promise narratives, the moments of revelation where God engages mostly with the patriarchs, though I would include in this a similar promise moment that happens between God and Hagar, just so you know. But these are moments where God reaches out to the patriarchs and promises them protection, property, progeny, right? And basically, God promises the individual patriarchs a future, a better and possible. And this question of whoever asked the miracles things, Ellie, is really quite interesting, because to some extent in the Bible, you do need miracles to have those better and possible future. But when God interacts with the patriarchs, first, God's, the promise seems possible, and not just the promise of a future, a better future for the patriarchs, but of course, a promise for for all the descendants of the patriarchs. And I know I didn't, just because I know I didn't include this. We're going to be looking at very specific, prophetic texts in a moment, but I just to, illustrate An example of this is the moment of revelation that Jacob has, the promise moment that Jacob has, that follows the image, the dream that he has of the Jacob's ladder, the sulam, where God says, though this is in Genesis 28. I'm just going to read it out loud so you can have an illustration of this kind of promise moment. God says to Jacob, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. The ground on which you are lying, I will assign to you and your offspring. So you're going to have that's property. Your descendants shall be the dust of the earth, right? That's the progeny. You shall spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you and your descendants. Remember, I am with you. I will protect you. That's protection, right? Wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. So this is a moment where God is promising, and I would say giving hope to Jacob at this particular moment. Interestingly enough, so if you look through the Torah, and I'm happy to be in contact with anyone at to fill in the gaps or to give you text, but if you look at these promise narratives and when they occur, for the patriarchs and for Hagar as well, they tend to be in transitional moments and moments of vulnerability for the patriarchs. So in other words, moments where these individuals may be experiencing a feeling of despair. And that is the moment that God sort of engages them and particularly gives them hope. But in this is just a perfect example of where you can see the three things, right? How is God cultivating hope in Jacob? God promises Jacob protection. God promises Jacob progeny, and God promises Jacob property. And it's not just to Jacob himself, but really to all of his descendants. So this is a perfect example in the Chumash, right? In the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, where I think you are cultivating hope. So that's really interesting. So then you have to think about, I mean, it is quite interesting to think about where else do you find hope in the Bible? And if this was a live class, we could, go back and forth because it is an opportunity for me to sort of think about it in other contexts. I recently taught this material similar to this sessions elsewhere, and somebody said the Psalms, which I do think is really quite interesting to think about hope in the Psalms. I would say hope in the Psalms is sort of, it's interesting to think about that. And, and I tend not to work with the Psalms, but I'm happy to think about it. But I do think you see hope expressed in some of the Psalms, and hope cultivated. But I would say also just along this line of thinking about the relationship between hope and despair. So there's a category of Psalms called Psalms of Lament. And it's interesting in those moments where psalmists are really, expressing their own despair and the suffering they feel and the struggles they're feeling. In those moments, they then tend to switch into expressing hope. So it's interesting to think about the relationship between hope and despair as expressed in the Psalms. So that's another place to find it. By the way, if you just ask me and nobody has, but I'm going to say it anyway. I would say the least hopeful book. I mean, that's an interesting question. Actually, I'll ask that question. We can return. I actually have an answer to that question, but I'm not gonna give you my answer. So this is like, Manish Tana, the 4 questions, and you'll see, I'll be curious to see what you say. But if I'm gonna ask you all the question of what you would identify as the least hopeful or hopeless book in the Tanakh. I will be curious, and then we can see your responses, and then I will give you mine. Oh, okay. So Deborah Zucker, my student. Okay. Excellent. Job. I actually think Job, I mean, it's interesting, Job. I was going, so Deborah, who's on this call, who I can't see, but I'm happy to have you on this call, was my student and knows this firsthand. But I will always say to my students the book that I actually kind of don't like. Actually, I don't find Eicha. All of this is interesting. And again, there are no answers to this. I don't want you to think, I'm offering you questions that I think are just interesting to think about. So you can make a case for Job. But Kohelet has always been, for me, the most hopeless book. And frankly, because it isn't future focused, right? It's that the entire world is on, nothing's new under the sun, right? It's all cyclical. You all return back to the beginning. There really is nothing to hope for. So in a certain way, it's like a perfect example of hopelessness expressed in the Bible. But interestingly enough, which is where I want us to go from here, where I do think you find hope expressed and cultivated, not just expressed, but actually cultivated. I think in some ways it's the job of these folks to cultivate hope, and that is in the prophets. And I actually want to say something about that because it's really quite, it's interesting. Because for the most part, right, the prophets are not optimists, right? They actually are people that have religious hope by my definition, but they are not optimists, right? They're not cockeyed optimists. They're not walking around saying everything is, roses and daisies, right? They're in fact, I mean, the prophets are mostly known and defined for their doom and gloom, right? That is in fact what they are communicating. And they mostly communicate doom and gloom and sort of prepare people, as I said, sort of what is the Torah oriented towards, right? Is it oriented towards being in Israel? Is it oriented towards being in exile? So let's just say the prophets, for the most part, except for the one that we're going to be looking at in a moment, are actually oriented towards exile. So they are basically preparing the population, right, to experience exile. So they are, in fact, communicating a lot of despair, a lot of doom and gloom, but they also are deeply religious people. And they are also working despite that doom and gloom. They attempt to generate hope, particularly in a context of doom and gloom, right? And as I said, they really are, I would say, practitioners of this, what I'm calling religious hope, because they do believe, and now I'm going to use the word God, because now we can talk about the prophets, so we can use language like God, but they do belief in God, here I am, believe that God is guiding Israel towards a better future, and they have hope despite the fact that they have despair, right? But they are not, but they name the despair, right? And that's, to me, important to recognize. So what I wanted to do in the time that we have is to look at two prophets and to really think about how these prophets express or cultivate hope. The first prophet, we're just going to look at, and again, for those of you who've learned with me before, know that this is probably my most favorite individual, Yirmiyahu. I think in some ways is the best example of a prophet who is, communicating doom and gloom, but at the same time, in preparing his population to experience exile and for some really hard and difficult times ahead. But as we're going to see, he does also, there are moments and passages where he is attempting to cultivate hope. So it's important to have some sense of his time period so you understand what, when he's living, when he's preaching. So his dates are usually identified as being 627, to be very specific, 627 to 587 BCE. So this is a very specific, and when we get to the prophets, as you'll see, because the next prophet we're going to look at, it's also quite easy to date this prophet. So, when it's harder to talk about dating with other material, but when you get to the prophets, you can talk about dating, chronologically speaking. So he is from 627 to 587. This is a very, very particular time in ancient Israel's history. So you could say this is a time of tremendous transformation in the ancient world. You have at the beginning of when Jeremiah is preaching, you have the fall of the great superpower known as Assyria. And you have the rise of the next great superpower known as Babylon. So Jeremiah lives right there. He's witnessing the fall of Assyria and the rise of Babylon. And basically, for the most of his, 50 odd chapters, he is basically saying you're going into exile. Things look pretty grim. He has a very, very grim message to give the people. And because he actually offers so much doom and gloom and not much hope, he gets into a lot of trouble from Israel itself. And he actually they kick him out. He gets sent into exile. He goes actually sent into exile into Egypt. And not actually into Babylon, but he runs into more trouble with his own kind than he does with, the Babylonians. So his message is, for the most part, things do not look good for you, and you guys are going to be heading into exile, and you better deal with it. Not a hopeful message. But in the middle of the book, there are a couple of chapters that are actually, because this is where you do, I would say basically chapters 30 to 33. So you can look for this yourselves. It's some of the most beautiful poetry that you have. This is called the Book of Comfort. And it really is, it still has some, doom and gloom in there as well, but it also has really hopeful passages. So I just wanted to look at this particular passage because it may be quite familiar to you. Actually, it's the Haftarah that we read on Rosh Hashanah. So it's actually, maybe quite familiar, and it's a very famous image. And I just want to use this as an example again, because I like it's short, it's sweet. And this question of, sort of how does this prophet cultivate hope, right? This is a moment where God is offering hope. One could say to Rachel, but let's say Rachel is sort of the stand-in for Israel, itself. So God is offering hope. And just this question of like, how does God offer hope in this very short passage, to me is really quite interesting. So I'm going to just read it because it is so short in the Hebrew, and then you have the English here as well. So it says, Ko amar Adonai, kol barama nishma, nehi bechi tamarim Rachel mevaka al baneha, be'anet lechinachem al baneha ki enenu. Ko amar Adonai, min'i kolech mi bechi ve'enayich mi dim'ah, Ki yesh sachar lefulatech ne'um Adonai, v'shabu me'eretz oyev, v'yesh tikva la'acharitech ne'um Adonai, v'shabu v'anim ligvulam. It's a beautiful, beautiful image. So the translation that you have here, thus said God, a cry is heard in Ramah, wailing, bitter weeping, Rachel crying for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children who are gone. So God then says, and in my reading, setting this up, this is the moment where God is offering comfort and cultivating hope. So what does God do? God says to Rachel, restrain your voice from weeping, your eyes from shedding tears, for there is reward for your labor, declares God. They shall return from the enemy's land, and there is hope for your future, declares God. Your children shall return to their country, right? So the hope of restoration, right? If you just sort of, what's the message of this? Why should, it's very clear. Rachel, Mother Rachel, weeping Mother Rachel, why you should have hope is because your children will return. So we're going to be talking about, because to me, just to sort of tell you where I'm going, even if we don't necessarily get us all going there, ending up there, I actually wanted us to think about this image of the mother, right? That we're going to see actually, we see it here, this weeping mother, this inconsolable mother that is about to be consoled. And then we're going to see it in the other passages that I've also collected for us to talk about today. And so, the use of this image of the mother and how she is able to communicate or convey hope is, I think, really something for us to think about, the power of this maternal image. But leaving that aside for just a moment, just in this, it's really a beautiful little passage, right? Don't weep anymore. Yesh sachar lefulatech, there is reward for your labor, right? They will return from the enemy land. There is hope. You have hope for your future. So again, if we were really learning live and together, I would stop now and sort of, ask you to tell me, what about this passage, how is hope cultivated by this passage? But just in the interest of time, because I do want to open it up at the end, I'm going to just give you my own sort of what I find interesting about this passage. First is this language of reward, I find really quite interesting, right? So, the sense that you will be rewarded for your suffering. There's something very transactional about that, right? And then we have the question of, obviously the relationship between hope and despair, but that your future reward, and particularly with Jeremiah, it's the sense of something that is owed to you, right? You are owed this, right? You deserve this. You've earned it, that somehow the suffering that you have has earned you this future reward. I find really quite amazing. And the sense of the future, so it's not just that it's a reward that you've earned, but that this future, this hopeful future, is very much connected to the past. Right? There's a continuum that seems to it being, suggested here. So your labor results in reward. Your labor, your past, will enable you to have this future. And the other piece to this that I also think is interesting, and it just sort of how the language is constructed, right? How hope is cultivated. And we're going to see this in the other passages, sort of the inversion of the images of suffering. Right. So one of the things, and this is true without the prophets. I mean, as I said, there's a lot of images of destruction, right? A lot of bad things that are being, that will happen, are being described. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is that when the prophets then want to turn the table and cultivate hope in their audience, they invert that image, which may be why the maternal image is so strong, right? So here you have an inconsolable mother who's grieving over her children, but that's the despair. But when the despair gets inverted into the hope, the children are going to return. So this connection to the past, the future is connected to the past, but in a very kind of, real way, right? That you will have the suffering that you have, those images of suffering will be inverted into more hopeful images. So this passage to me actually in some ways encapsulates everything I would say about how the prophets work to cultivate hope. I'm going to move on to another prophet, but I don't know, Ellie, if there are is there any comments or specific questions up to this point, or should I move on?
There's so many. So I'm like in this place where part of me is like, ooh, do we want to jump in or do we want to keep going? I think give me a second. Just let me look. I've been trying to keep notes of what people are asking about.
Because I'm about to move into the prophet Isaiah.
Let's hold until we get both and then we can get more kind of.
Okay. I mean, we can go, that's fine. So as I said, I think for the most part, prophets are doom and gloom. And with, rare moments, as we just saw in Jeremiah, where there is some consolation and hope being expressed and cultivated. The prophet that I would say is almost pure hope. And for those of you, I mean, I've probably taught some of you before, and you've certainly been in the, JTS landscape to know that this might not sound strange, but there's a prophet that we label as called Second Isaiah. So we have the book of Isaiah, but then we have within the book of Isaiah, we identify actually two, if not three different voices. I don't want to deal with the three voices. I'm going to deal with the second voice. But the second voice, second Isaiah, is the voice that we encounter when we get to chapter 40 of the book of Isaiah. And I always say to my students, there is no doubt that you are now dealing with a different voice, an individual that is living at a very, very different time than the individual and the voice that you encountered in the first 39 chapters of the book of Isaiah. So for those of you who, are interested in history, right? So the first Isaiah is basically 8th century BCE, pretty clear. And then you get to chapter 40 of Isaiah. And again, you don't have this, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. Just so you know, it is very clear that you are dealing with somebody who's in a very different reality. And at the start of chapter 40, it's clear that Israel, that you're around the year 540. So you go from, 8th century to the year 540. And it's apparent that the prophet that is speaking at the beginning of chapter 40 is anticipating Israel's return from exile. So you are in a very, like, just wrap your brains around that a second, right? So Jeremiah, you're in the year 622, Israel is going into exile, 586, you're heading into exile. Second Isaiah, which you get in Isaiah chapter 40, you're in about the year 540, and you are returning from exile. It is absolutely clear that this is the case. And I'm just going to give you, I mean, this one, you can say you can trust me on this one, but you can, just so you have it. I mean, how do we know that? So the most famous passage, which you all, I'm sure, also know very well, the beginning of chapter 40, I'm just going to read this out loud. Comfort, this is the Nachamu passage. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and declare to her that her term of service is over, that her iniquity is paid, for she is received at the hand of the Lord, double for all her sins, right? A voice cries out, clear in the desert, a road for the Lord, level in the wilderness, a highway for our God. Let every valley be raised, every hill and mount made low, that the rugged ground become level and the ridges become a plain. The presence of the Lord shall appear, and all flesh as one shall behold, for the Lord himself has spoken. So this is a description essentially of, I mean, it's really kind of great, because it's, as we're heading into Pesach and thinking about Yitziat Mitzrayim, you could say, this is Yitziat Golan, they're getting out of the exile at this moment, but this image of the time has come, you've paid for your sins, right? You get to leave Babylon, you're going to head back into the land. And second Isaiah is really living in the time where there is the expectation of return. And, the king who is, responsible for the return of Israel is, of course, the king Cyrus. And one of the things that makes it very clear that you're dating this material for that time is that, in fact, second Isaiah names Cyrus. So you know that he's living at the moment where Israel is being able to leave Babylon and return to the land. So there is probably, I mean, this is an individual living in, for the Bible's time, if there is any example of a kind of hopeful moment. And if you wanted to say, back to my initial question, is the Bible oriented towards the land? It's second Isaiah. The answer to that would be yes. I just think second Isaiah is kind of like a small part of the Bible at large. But for second Isaiah, the answer is yes. He's anticipating return into the land. It's a very hopeful moment. So second Isaiah, in conveying and cultivating hope in the people, his audience, he creates an image, right? A figure that appears throughout second Isaiah that is really part, I would say, of cultivating Israel's hope. And that is the image of Bat Zion, daughter Zion, who also can be referred to sometimes as Mother Zion. Right? It's this female figure that second Isaiah cultivates. And in some ways, she tells Israel's story, but it's really, she is the figure that I would say works to cultivate hope in second Isaiah's audience. This figure of Bat Zion, daughter Zion, which is also Mother Zion. And as I said a moment ago, one of the things that really is interesting, it connects these three passages that I want us to sort of at least touch upon to the Jeremiah passage, is really this image, this maternal imagery, this mother figure, and the power of the mother figure to communicate hope. Right. That's really what I'm going at. And that's, again, if we don't get to that end question of like, can the Bible be a resource? One of the ways that I think it could is sort of to capture some of this maternal imagery, because I think it is powerful as a to help us cultivate, as a resource for us in cultivating language of hope. So Mother Zion, this maternal image, appears in several passages. 3 of them I'm sharing here. And I think they are there, that she is here to help cultivate hope in 2nd Isaiah's audience. What's really interesting is that she is a complicated figure, right? And he presents her, even though there are the 3 passages I want us to look at, Isaiah 49, Isaiah 54, and then Isaiah 66. You're dealing with the same figure, but this maternal figure is almost like you're studying her from a different angle each time. Right? Very often when you think about mothers in the Bible, you sort of feel like there's one story that the Bible tells over and over again about a mother. She's usually a barren woman, and then she ultimately miraculously has a child. But one of the things that, if I'm somebody who studies women in the Bible quite a lot, is you realize that the Bible tells a lot more than one story. And so here's an example of a maternal figure that actually she appears in various different ways. So in this first passage that we're looking at, we actually have an image of a bereaved mother, and then her sorrows, God attempts to comfort her. So that's interesting. So she's a bereaved mother. In the second passage, which these are probably all somewhat familiar images to you, the second passage that we're going to look at is Isaiah 54. And there you have the more traditional barren woman who will ultimately have children. So the first image, you have the bereaved mother that's going to be welcoming back her children. The second image, you're going to have the barren woman, the barren mother, who then ultimately has children. And then the third image, which is in some ways my favorite, is this image of a woman who's having a baby, but experiences no pain in childbirth. Talk about a miracle, right? So even before that's the image that we have in Isaiah 66, before she gives birth, she has a child. There's no pain in childbirth, which is such an interesting, sort of different way of looking at the maternal image. So you have 3 different sort of maternal images that are all used differently and are all used to sort of cultivate a language of hope. So to me, it's just interesting to think about that. So let's just look very quickly at them, and then we can hopefully have some time to open up for some conversation. So let's look at the first one, which is Isaiah 49. So you have the image of, so the opening line here, I'll read the opening line in English and then, in Hebrew, and then I'll read God's response. So you actually hear Zion speak. Bat Zion speaks, and this is amazing, right? But Tomer Zion, Azavani Adonai, Adonai Shechechani. So Zion says, God has forsaken me, right? My Lord has forgotten me. An aside, by the way, that sounds very much like a psalm of lament, just saying. So you might want to actually at some point, look at Psalm 22. So she's really lamenting her, she feels abandoned by God, as does the psalmist in Psalm 22. So you should look at that. So she feels, one could say, this is utter despair. And God then responds to her and gives her hope. So let's just look at that. God says, can a woman forget her baby or disown the child of her womb? Though she might forget, I could never forget you. I love this passage too, because, basically saying like, okay, well, a woman, a mother, a mere mortal mother may forget their child, but I, God, will never forget my child, right? So that's a kind of interesting moment, but I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are ever before me. Swiftly your children are coming. Those who ravaged and ruined you shall leave you, right? So this is that moment of, all the people that, inflicted harm on you, they're going to be leaving. Your oppressors are leaving, and your children are coming. Look up all around you and see, they're all assembled. They're coming to you. As I live, declares God, you shall don them all like jewels. Deck yourself with them like a bride. As for your ruins and desolate places and your land laid waste, you shall soon be crowded with settlers, while destroyers stay far from you. The children you thought you had lost, this is an amazing line, shall yet say in your hearing, The place is too crowded for me. Make room for me to settle. I'm going to stop there for a second. So again, this inversion, right? The connection between hope, between despair and hope. So this woman who feels abandoned by God, right? Abandoned by her children, bereaved woman, right? The woman that, she thought her children, and the language seems to indicate that she thought her children were dead, right? And God is now going to invert that image. The children that you thought were lost are going to suddenly come back to you, right? And that's this the hope is based, the future is kind of based on the past, the inversion of the suffering. You're going to be welcoming these children back to you. But so that's, interesting. But to me, what's most interesting about this passage is what she actually says to God. And, I'll read it in the Hebrew, and then, we can move on to the next passage. But so God gives her this hope. You're going to welcome your children back. There's going to be so many of them that they're not going to even have enough room. And then it says this is, and it's verse 21, so you can look at it. V'amart bilvavech mi yaladli et ella v'ani shechula v'galmuda gola v'tzura eli mi gidelhen ani nisharti levadi ela efohem. So she says, and it seems that she says this to herself, wait a minute, who are these children, basically, right? Who raised these children? I've been bereaved. I've been abandoned. The word actually galmuda is interesting and what it means, but sort of seems to be another word for barren, right? I've been exiled. I've been rejected. Who raised these children? I stayed alone. Where did they come from? Right? I mean, look, you can see the English. I'm giving you my own translation, but this is quite remarkable. So I always like this passage because I think she's actually pushing back on God and his hopeful message. Like, these children are coming back. And I almost want to say, is she refusing to accept them? Like, who are these kids? Right? Where did they come from? And she also might be saying, like, maybe it wasn't worth the suffering, right? I was abandoned. I was left alone. Who raised them? But to me, there's, ending with her voice and in the question is really quite amazing. So that's the first passage. Let's look at the second one, which is, in some ways, a more familiar passage to all of you in terms of the sort of typical trope of the, what you think of a maternal story, right? The barren woman that has her children, that is able to have a child. So this is Isaiah 54, and just read a couple of these verses just to get a flavor for this. But we have in the Hebrew, Roni akara lo yalada pitchi rina betahali lo chala ki rabim b'nei shomema mi b'nei be'ula amar Adonai. Harchivi mekom ohalech virot mishkanotayich yatu al tachsochi ha'arichi metarayich betedotayich chazeki ki yamin usmol tifrotzi v'zarech goyim yirash va'arim nishamot yoshivu. So shout, O infertile one. So there we have the akara, rejoice, O infertile one. You who bore no child, shout aloud for joy, you who never gave birth, for the children of the wife forlorn shall outnumber those of the espoused, said God. Enlarge the site of your tent, extend the size of your dwellings, do not hold back, lengthen the ropes, and drive the pegs firm. For you shall spread out to the right and the left, and your offspring shall dispossess nations and shall people the desolate towns. Okay, so to me, this is just, again, the relationship between despair and hope, but this inversion of this image, like, you, not bereaved woman, bereaved mother we had, but now it's the barren mother is going to have all these children. And this is the image that I always think of, the Nutcracker and the woman with the big dress, whatever her name is, that has all the children that are underneath the dress. I mean, this is exactly this image of, like, you're going to stretch your tent out and you're going to, so that you can, have shelter all your, your many children, which is really quite a fun image. By the way, also for an inversion, which is just this actually passage that you have here of make your tents wide and strengthen the walls of your tent and the pegs of your tent. This is an exact inversion of a passage that we have actually in the book of Jeremiah in chapter 10, verse 20. You can look it up, but the same language of exactly precisely the destruction that is going to happen, the tent walls that are going to fall down, the pegs that are going to fall, right? It's like second Isaiah is using that language and inverting it to give this hope. So your tent will be built again, and you will have to widen its walls to welcome in all of your children. I wanted to say one other thing about this, which is really to me also, because we're not going to have time to really, I don't even know what time we are. I don't know how much we have. I've lost count of the time.
We're
So
at 1:10 or 2:10.
Okay.
Sorry, 2:10.
Okay. All right. So good. I somehow can't see but that's fine. I'm giving you all these passages for you to sort of compare and contrast and look at them and, think about the sort of larger issues of how they express hope. But to me, what's really quite interesting is what happens next when God says, fear, this is in verse 4, fear not, you shall not be shamed. Do not cringe, you shall not be disgraced, for you shall forget the reproach of your youth and remember no more the shame of your widowhood. For the one who made you, whose name is God of hosts, will marry you, will espouse you, the Holy One of Israel, who is called God of all the earth. I mean, to me, this is actually quite interesting, right? So the sense of hope for the future, right? You're going to have, but what I think second Isaiah is doing differently than Jeremiah in a way, and I just want to suggest this. I have to think about it more, but in some ways he's disconnecting Zion's future from her past, right? You're going to forget the shame of your past. You're not going to remember it. It's like a clean beginning. Whereas I really feel with the Jeremiah passage and the voice of Rachel in that passage, she's going to be, you're going to have reward for your suffering. This is now a very different image of you're going to forget the shameful past when you were abandoned. It's going to be a completely new beginning. And to that fact, I just want to say this, because it's one of the most interesting passages you have, is verse 9. I mean, God will say in verse 8, I was angry for a very brief second. I was very angry at you, but then I'm now full of mercy, says God. And then God in verse 9 says, Kimei Noach Zotli, because these are like the waters of Noach to me. This is really, first of all, it's always interesting when you have a Bible passage refer to another Bible passage. So the fact that you have second Isaiah talking about Noach, that's interesting. But what I want to just say is it kind of connects to what I just said, which is that in this hopeful future that second Isaiah is giving daughter Zion, it's like a fresh beginning. It's a recreation, right? To invoke the waters of Noah, which again, if you've learned with me before, there's actually, that's a recreation narrative, right? The world gets recreated at that moment. So it's almost like God is saying to Bat Zion, your past is not going to, your future is not going to be connected. It's going to be a fresh beginning. All right. So the last passage, and then we can open it up, is Isaiah 66. And as I said, I mean, this is a great passage in so many ways. But this image, it's a maternal image again that appears in second Isaiah to convey hope. So that's what we're looking at. But this is a different image in that it is the woman that's going to have a painless birth. To think about the relationship between despair and hope, the maternal image is an interesting image because you do have the pain of childbirth, which gives the joy of having a child. Right. So there's something about that image that conveys both pain and hope and joy, right? Pain and joy. I wouldn't say despair, but you could say suffering and joy, right? So there's something about like the maternal image that I think is right for use in kind of hope language. But second Isaiah in chapter 66 gives us this image of this woman who labors without any pain. And it says, before she labored, she was delivered. Before her pangs came, she bore a son, right? And then it says in verse 8, whoever heard anything like this? Whoever witnessed such events? Can a land pass through travail in a second? Can a land be born in a day? Can a nation be born all at once? Meaning when the Bible asks a rhetorical question, usually the rhetorical question is, of course not, right? Like it's asking for it. It seems to know the answer. And yet here's the miracle. Yet Zion travailed and at once bore her children, right? So she gives birth without having any birth pain. And then just to sort of say this passage on it continues on and again gives hope. So God continues and says, shall I who bring on labor not bring about birth? Says God. Shall I who cause birth shut all the womb? Said your God. Rejoice with Jerusalem and be glad with her. Famous passage. All you who love her. Join in her jubilation, all you who mourned over her. Right? So you're mourning, again, relationship between hope and despair, but all your mourning will now become jubilation, that you may suck from her breast consolation to the full, that you may draw from her bosom glory to your delight. For thus said God, I will extend to her prosperity like a stream, the wealth of nations like a wadi and flood, and you shall drink of it, and you shall be carried on shoulders and dandled upon knees, like one whom a mother comforts, so I will comfort you. You shall find comfort in Jerusalem. So this is just, and then we can open it up to the general conversation. I like to sort of say the maternal imagery in this is really, really quite interesting. I can connect it for you a little bit to Isaiah 49. When people look for God language in the Tanakh at large, that is sort of female God language, this is one of the passages that people like to focus on, because God is sort of in some ways obviously comparing God's self to being a mother, right? And similarly, I didn't say this when we did the Isaiah 49, but it's sort of similarly there when Zion is like, you abandoned me, and God says, does a mother may abandon their child, but I don't. These are the two passages that scholars like to focus upon to sort of suggest that there is maternal imagery that's associated with God. I think, I like to do that as well, but I realize that I think it's a bit of a stretch. It's certainly using maternal tropes, and this is certainly, but one of the things, and just to, because I always like to complicate things and not make it, sort of not let us rest too easy with that. To me, one of the things that's really quite interesting is that in both of those examples, God sort of outmothers daughter Zion. Right. So in the first one, God's like, well, a normal human mother will forget their child, but I won't. And in this one, right, it's the sense of and even the language of extending, it's almost like God will be nursing and giving all and nurturing and feeding, right? And in a certain way, I would say even here is the uber mother, right, will outmother even Bat Zion. So I'm going to leave these passages. I don't know if we want to have specific, if people have specific questions about these passages, that's great. I had just, and we could go in this direction or not. I know that we're probably running out of time, but, I want to just step back and sort of return to my initial questions and see if people have thoughts on these as well. So just to think together is hope essential for religious life? I think about this a lot because I think it is in a kind of Western religious idea, right? That you are moving always forward to a future and guided towards that future. And it may be not the case in other kinds of religions that you are so future focused. So it's actually a real thing to think about. Is hope in fact essential for religious life? And then this question of how do we, I think it's essential that we develop a capacity for hope. How do we do that? And do these images that you find in the Bible or any other images that you find in any kind of Jewish, in the canon that we've inherited, are they helpful for us in developing hope? And then this, final question, which to me is, an unanswerable question. It depends on where you sit in your, but is the Bible overall a hopeful book? I do think that you can find hope expressed in the Bible. And I think it has images and language that I think are useful for us to cultivating hope. But I'm not sure that makes the Bible itself a hopeful book. I think in my opinion, I think it may be more kind of oriented towards exile than it is towards Israel. So those are my sort of comments. And then I'm happy to have questions, or I don't know how we want to, Ellie.
Oh, we have lots of questions. And I think I'm going to go back a little bit to start. One is, and this came up from a few different people in a few different ways, so I'm going to try and merge, that a lot of people were pointing to Hatikva.
Mm-hmm.
And then the idea of tikva, that, in this whole discussion of hope, none of the verses you presented to us had tikva explicitly in there.
Jeremiah.
Oh, it did. Okay. Sorry. I was,
So you
clearly
should,
I was
just so, no, it's a great question. And in fact, Jeremiah, that's the language, which is why I actually wanted to use it in the Hebrew. It says, right, it's yesh sachar lefulatech and yesh tikva,
Oh.
right, la'acharitech. So, that's interesting. Tikva, it's not actually a very common word. And in fact, the line from Hatikva actually is it's like Ezekiel 37 in the dry bones passage.
Which is not a very helpful part of the Bible.
Well, it is kind of, it's the sense of future restoration. But, the meaning of tikva, like just sort of the etymology, it's an interesting word. And it appears one of the explanations is and this is good for what I was saying, like as a cord, right? A rope, a cord. And, so again, if I'm making the case that hope needs, like, there's a connection between the past and the future, right? That it has to be like the image of a thread or a hope is actually, a thread or a cord is, I think, a really powerful image, right? That the past and the suffering, will lead towards the joy. The past is connected to the future, and the sense that that the future has to be possible. I think its connection to the past helps us sort of think of the future that's possible, as opposed to a miracle, which seems to just kind of come out of nowhere.
Someone just put in the chat the connection to the Rahab story and the cord of hope.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And in there specifically.
Right.
So if this is a Bible of exile as opposed to Israel, how do we orient ourselves towards hope?
Well, I actually think, to me, again, it gets back to that kind of, I sound like, I don't want to sound like I have all the answers, because I think these are, to me, no, I get it. Because but these questions are such rich theological questions. And I just want to understand, I want to be clear that, I think about these things, but, I don't have like, I'm the answers necessarily worked out in that way. But to me, I actually think that the relationship between despair and hope is real. And I do think that in some ways, hope is mostly expressed, it's aspirational. And, we started this conversation with, I don't know if you were asking or somebody on the chat, but this sort of, is it hope if it's like, I just want things to stay the same? And I kind of said, no. And I think that's what I'm saying. Like, I actually think you experience hope when things are not perfect.
Otherwise,
right.
It's an experience of contentment.
Yeah, which may be
hope.
right. And I'm not, that's sort of why I said, but like, I'm not in, maybe it is an Eastern-Western divide, but, I actually like the aspirational qualities of hope, and, the thought that they can help transform, but not necessarily get us to. So I don't find it I actually like I don't find it despairing to think of it as an exilic oriented book.
That there's a goal orientation, as opposed to an end. Your
aspiration. I think religion is fundamentally aspirational.
with the maternal symbolism, and I think there's, this parental symbolism, and honestly, is there a sense that does hope become a more feminine quality in general? Is there some part of it that in your sense of this, that hope
No,
is
I mean,
identified
certainly
as
in the
feminine?
Bible, I don't think so. I mean, I think that these passages, I mean, look, I selected, and there's another figure that you meet in second Isaiah that also tells Israel's story, and that is the figure of the suffering servant. And it's interesting to think about the relationship between the suffering servant and Bat Zion as sort of like they function similarly, but they're sort of very gendered images.
Mm,
So I don't actually think that there's, that it's somehow, essentialists, and that, women are, or that images related to women are sort of, kind of more hopeful images. I mean, I think the maternal, like the mother, the pregnant body, I think that is actually like it's an image you encounter a lot, particularly in the prophets. By the way, just so as I said, like one of the things that makes the pregnant body so interesting is in fact it is about the pain of labor
mhm.
that ultimately results in a child.
And
But
the concern of potential death at this,
100%, and so in fact, uh, most of the images related to the maternal body and pregnancy are actually used as part of the kind of horror, language that the prophets use, like women writhing in childbirth, right, is an image for fear and suffering. So it's, it mostly comes in a kind of negative context, and it's in these moments that it comes in a more positive context.
Is there any part of that last Isaiah that is getting back to a um tree of knowledge of good and evil moment in the Bible, where that's what potentially, if their labor would have been without pain, is there any
I
connection?
don't think in that particular passage, but I do think, I mean, I think that passage is sort of like, understand again that in the prophets, the image of the woman writhing in childbirth is an image of fear. So there's something about the use of this image now, like you're not going to be afraid, you're not going to die. I do think that the main Noach
Yeah,
image of Isaiah 54 is more like, I mean, that's clearly a moment of recreation. And Ezekiel, I mean, I do, I would recommend, people looking at Ezekiel 37, because the dry bones is a hopeful image of, but it is a recreation, right? These dead bodies are going to be restored and, revived. And there's a lot of language in Ezekiel 37 that is evocative, that takes you right back to Genesis 1 to, chapter 1. So, to me, there is like a sense of recreation, but not so much the gender dynamic. That's what you meant. Like sort of like
got it. No.
um,
Yeah, a little bit of a recalibration of that earlier.
yeah,
As we're kind of reaching the end of our time, and we all know that there's an eclipse to be seen.
yeah.
Maybe there
But
is.
don't look out without the glasses. I
Right,
just
you
looked out
must
my
have the
window. You're not
glasses.
supposed to do that.
We are not endorsing that. We don't
Yeah.
want that worldview. Um, if just as we're in this kind of, this is a moment, this has been such a fabulous workshop seminar to have as we're headed into our Passover
Yeah.
season. What are the ways in which this is informing your current, moment? And again, as we're kind of wrapping up, again, thank you for sharing something that's in process. I think that's been the joy of this particular series, is we get to see how our scholars are thinking through ideas and what's shaping their thinking. So it's nice to see something in formation.
I mean, I would say, like, I feel like like I am actively self-consciously trying to bring hope into, like, making it overt, like actually having a conversation around hope and aspiration. And I do think, like obviously the Seder and, next year in Jerusalem, and the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and which is faith, but also hope, right? A sense that there is going to be a better future. And I think it's just the desire, like, I mean, because it's like obviously I think there's a lot of darkness. I mean, literally, we're about to be, go into real darkness, but, I mean, there's a lot of darkness right now. And I think, what I'm trying to do with this project and just teaching it is really just encouraging us that we have to cultivate this language. And I actually think the story of the Seder, what we're about to tell, is actually, it is about hope and aspiration and moving towards something better. And I think we just have to, it's easy for us to only focus on the plagues and the darkness and the earthquakes and all the things that we know that we are fixated on. And I think it take the opportunity to express hope and cultivate hope in others.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us today. And this series has been fabulous because I think we've really gotten to see these points in process. I will share with you the comments of people as from the chat, and especially in terms of where they see hope in the Bible as you're kind of as your
Great.
group thinking these pieces. Thank you all for sticking with us. If you are interested in coming again, our next session actually will continue on this theme of Passover. Dr. Robbie Harris is going to be talking about kind of how the Haggadah came together and looking at the kind of fundamental central questions of the Haggadah itself. And again, these series wouldn't be possible without the support of sponsors and donors. So please feel free to make a sponsorship. We have 3 levels. We'd love to have your support. Thank you so much, Amy. We really, really enjoyed this session. I really enjoyed this session.